Hi, I am Patrick Grzanka, Associate Professor of Psychology and Chair of the Interdisciplinary Program in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. I am so glad to be speaking with you today from my dining room where I've spent most of the pandemic working. Um, I am honored to have you engage my work and to be reading this piece from Buzzword to Critical Psychology, an invitation to take intersectionality seriously. In this mini talk, I am not going to share with you any slides. I'm just going to chat pretty briefly, but hopefully clearly, about my work, the kinds of questions that I've asked in my career thus far, the things that I'm interested in, particularly as they pertain to intersectionality, which has occupied much of my intellectual work as well as my activist work. And I'm going to try to give you a little bit of background on this paper, which I actually think has been percolating for me for about 15 years. As I said, my name is Patrick Grzanka. I'm an associate professor of psychology. My pronouns are he, him, his. And my training and background and the scholarship that I do today is deeply interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinary means, of course, drawing upon different disciplinary perspectives to address problems. Intersectionality, which was first appeared in print in 1989 in a really landmark legal studies article by Kimberly Crenshaw. This term came to name something that has been a keynote of Black feminist and other women of color feminist perspectives for quite some time, a sort of cornerstone of that form of intellectual inquiry, and as well as activism. In a 2017 paper with Carlos Santos and Bonnie Moradi, we defined intersectionality as the study and critique of how multiple social systems intersect to produce and sustain complex inequalities. Intersectionality seemed especially adept at helping us to look at systems. Not just that we have a racial identity, for example, as well as a sexual identity and a gender identity, but that racism or white supremacy, sexism, heterosexism, that these systematic social forces really are the ways that these identities come to matter. They become the structuring elements of social life because these systems create advantage and disadvantage unfairly and distribute life chances accordingly. Problems like white supremacy, like gendered racism, like the profound health inequities that we see really being underscored across our globe, these problems need nuanced, substantive, and sustained solutions. And intersectionality, I think, and I'm certainly an advocate of the approach, is one of the most valuable tools that we've got to really see how these social problems are informed by multiple systems of inequality and therefore need solutions that address those multiple social systems rather than privilege one social system like gender above all others. So I've been using lots of social theoretical language thus far, and hopefully we'll get a little bit more concrete as we move through these examples. But the paper that you read, it's not a case study. It really is a kind of theoretical or methodologically focused paper that tries to challenge us to think as psychologists or psychologists in training, like, what do we mean by this term intersectionality and how do we want to use it? So I would say that even though I reject the idea that intersectionality is a kind of proprietary academic object that's owned by like a single person or even a group of people, I actually have spent a lot of my career tracking really disconcerting uptake or use of the concept in the social sciences, and particularly in psychology. And these problematic uses of intersectionality, from my perspective, are ones that divorce intersectionality from its origins in Black women's intellectual work and activism, as well as the philosophical, creative, and activist work of women of color in the US and worldwide throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Okay, so this is why you see this chart in the article, or table rather, table 1, that's called Mapping Intersectionality's Uses and Abuses. So intersectionality presents this really big challenge to psychologists and to psychology because it really challenges this idea of the impartial observer of human behavior. So the paper really kind of picks up at Liz Cole's 2009 paper, which famously, it's a very widely cited paper, one of the most widely cited papers on intersectionality in psychology. The paper introduces these 3 questions, and these 3 questions are designed to help psychological researchers do the work that they do. Liz's questions are, number 1, who is included in this category? So who are we talking about? Who are we including or excluding when we define a demographic variable or when we talk about a group of people? Really important. What role does inequality play in this thing that we're studying? Okay, so where is inequity? Where is inequality? Where do we see people experiencing differential chances to succeed, to thrive, etc.? Different vulnerabilities. And then really importantly, because psychology is really all about, at least in statistics, about testing for differences, Liz Cole asks really provocatively, I think, where are there similarities? So where can we look across groups or across social categories to find consonances in experience, to find similarities in experiences that transcend demographic variables sometimes, so that we can see how systemic forces are at play and how they might affect different groups in different ways. So even though as she says, let's look for similarities, it's still about thinking about complexity. Not just trying to pretend that people are the same, of course, because that's not true, but that there are similarities in experiences. For example, the ways that women of color may experience gendered racism in ways that are similar and dissimilar depending on their racial identity or their gender identity, for example. Okay. So what my work, I first started conceiving of these 3 additional questions right in 2009 when I was working on my dissertation, and I numbered them very purposefully because I by no means think of these questions as replacements for the ones that Liz offered in 2009. I think those questions are still essential to critical intersectional work in psychology, but I've tried to offer 3 additional ones that might help, again, really take intersectionality seriously. Number 4, how can I address constructs and systems, not only identities? This question speaks to what I've called the epistemic riptide of psychology in another paper. And in that paper, I really refer to this notion of the epistemic riptide to describe the way that psychology as a discipline pulls psychologists towards the individual as the kind of locus of inquiry, and also variable-centered analyses that conceptualize psychological dynamics through the logic of variables. And variables, when it comes to the study of inequality, the variables that become really important often are these identity variables. So like, what is your racial identity? What is your sexual identity? What is your gender identity? And then how might that identity help us predict a difference? And it's not that we shouldn't do that, but that whenever we're asking questions about identities, they should always be linked to the systems that make those identities matter, that make us interested in those identities to begin with. So that's, again, returning to the beginning of my talk, this emphasis on systems as opposed to just identities. That leads right into question number 5. How is social power operating in this situation? Now, as I wrote in the paper, when we hear the word power in psychology, most often we think about statistical power, not social forces, the ephemera and the material elements of everyday life that shape human experiences, the way that individuals, groups, and institutions exert force on other people. Psychologists don't actually tend to be very good at studying power. And part of that is because we operationalize power dynamics in terms of behaviors, affect or emotion, cognition, such as somatic responses to stress and discrimination or non-conscious implicit bias. But social power is more complicated than that. Now, note that Liz's second question about inequality could get you here, kind of, but it could also lead you to merely enumerating disparities, namely how members of multiply marginalized groups wind up worse off than their dominant group contemporaries. And this kind of comparison is really quite different from actually understanding how power is producing a dynamic. So this means, I think this question, what I'm encouraging us to think about is like naming, qualifying, and measuring, if necessary, dynamics like white supremacy, settler colonialism, homonormativity and heteronormativity, cissexism, as contextual and fundamental factors in a given psychological issue or social problem. So rather than merely referring to like a historical dynamic to set the stage for a psychological issue like prejudice or discrimination, really understanding these kinds of dynamics as integral to psychological functioning. And that's what I mean about taking power then so seriously. The final question, number 6, although I'm sure you could come up with 7, 8, 9, and truly an infinite number of really useful questions that could help sensitize our psychological work to intersectionality, I conclude with the sixth question. What role or roles can psychologists play in addressing this social problem? There are a number of purposeful word choices in this question, and I'll conclude by pointing to just a couple of them. Number 1, I really think it's important for psychologists to think of themselves as playing potential roles in social transformation. And so I wanted to encourage psychologists to think about roles beyond the scientist, the clinician, the teacher, etc., but as potentially activists, as public intellectuals, as scholar activists, as accomplices, as advocates in coalitions, and I use the term social problem rather than psychological problem, again, really to sensitize the way we think about inequality as psychologists as having as much to do with society, history, and culture as it does with cognition, affect, and behavior. Patricia Hill Collins, one of the founding mothers of intersectionality studies, says that intersectionality is a critical social theory. Not just a social theory, but a critical social theory. And it's distinguished as critical because it's about social justice for US Black women and for similarly situated groups worldwide. I challenge psychologists to ask themselves, if you've just described something, then how have you done social justice work? Where's the advocacy? Where's the change? Where's the coalition building? Where's the transformation of business as usual in the discipline? Social justice is a buzzword, but it doesn't have to be meaningless. It shouldn't be. We need to bring the transformative insights of social movements into the discipline so that we can conceptualize psychologists as change agents. If you're interested in learning more about my thoughts on intersectionality beyond this paper, check out my 2017 paper with Bonnie Moratti called Using Intersectionality Responsibly, in which we set out a number of guidelines for psychologists to think about when trying to do this work. That was published in our special section of the Journal of Counseling Psychology with Carlos Santos. You can also check out my book, Intersectionality, Foundations and Frontiers, which is now in its second edition, published in 2019. And you can also look for my forthcoming special issue of Translational Issues in Psych Science on intersectionality, which will be published later this year, December 2020. And it showcases what I'm calling the next generation of intersectionality scholarship, which is absolutely being led by early career scholars of color. And I'm so grateful to be able to shepherd their work in that special issue. I wish I were there to talk with you in person, but I hope that we get the chance to meet soon. So take care, good luck, wear a mask, and be well.